Hello, and welcome to We Can Do Better, a podcast about ending poverty in our time. I am your host, Frian Quigley. I'm a law professor who goes with my students every week to eviction court, where we represent some of the millions of people in the United States who are facing the loss of their homes. Many of the people we represent and folks across the country are also forced to skip filling prescriptions, go without health care, and even go hungry, despite living in the richest nation in the world. We can do better. Other nations already do far better, and the United States has done better in the past as well. So this podcast lifts up the many people and organizations who are working to make housing, healthcare, and a decent life enforceable human rights for all. This week we are excited to host Stephen Semler. Stephen is a co-founder of the Security Policy Reform Institute. It's a think tank that works to align U.S. foreign policy with working class interests. He also writes Polygraph, a data journalism newsletter, which I am proud to say I'm a paid subscriber and grateful that I am. We'll give links in the show notes, etc., but it is stephensemler.com is the way you get connected. And as Stephen describes himself in the newsletter introduction, he's a producer of charts and policy analysis for the working class. I love that phrase. And Stephen has previously worked in the international humanitarian response to Syria, worked with U.S. federal budget authorizations and appropriations, and done a lot of policy analysis and advocacy. And I'm going to ask more about your path soon. But Stephen, welcome to the show.
My pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me, friend.
Yeah. Well, I do want to talk more about your own path to getting to this and why data journalism is important. But I don't want to bury the lead for our folks. This is a podcast about ending U.S. poverty. And that makes a lot of us most interested, separate from the fact that war instituted by the United States is killing people. It's maiming people, it's destroying communities and families, but it's also leading to huge lost opportunities here. And you've done some terrific reporting, most recently, I think in April, in your newsletter about the $1.5 trillion that we're spending for the Pentagon and what it could fund instead. So, can you walk us through a little bit about what your research was and how you conducted that research and what you found about the lost opportunities here?
Well, it's really there's an antiquated debate, I think, about big versus small government. And in practice, that debate is basically over. It's not big versus small government or limited versus expansive government. It's really who government works for. And that's what this trade-off discussion is all about. When you talk about a $1.5 trillion military budget, which it's not just, the point of comparison isn't largest, versus Vietnam War or post-Cold War high. We're talking a military budget that's higher than World War II adjusted for inflation in real dollars. Not just a little bit more, but 20% more than World War II's peak. So Trump wants to spend over $200 billion more in 2027 on the military than the U.S. spent in 1945, which is shocking. It really is.
Yeah.
So I went through and charts are kind of my MO. So now I've chosen a theme and now I'm stuck with it. So for this one, it actually worked out really well because it was kind of how I pictured it in my head, is that you have one column showing a $1.5 trillion budget. And on the other, you have all the stuff that it could fund instead. And I thought it would be, friend, the thing is, when I talk about military spending, it's a grim subject. It really is. Thinking about what it does and all that stuff. But when you talk about trade-off, that's when it's fun, because you can imagine what the government can do. Instead, you can think about all of just a wholesale rejection, basically, of free market logics when it comes to military spending. It's a socialized system. It's government-directed spending, picking winners and losers, to use the old, phrase. It has socialized medicine through the VA. If it wanted to, it could unilaterally institute a $15 or $20 or $25 or $30 minimum wage just by saying, we're not going to contract you. The government's not going to contract you unless you pay your workers a fair amount. And we're not going to contract with you unless your workers are allowed to unionize. You think about what the government could do for housing and infrastructure in the climate crisis if it if it borrowed its logics for the military industrial complex and applied it to something useful, that's when it gets fun. And for this, it was fun because, I mean, I'll just walk you through the list real fast. I mean, all the stuff I was able to accomplish with 1.5 trillion, end world hunger, end global extreme poverty, end U.S. homelessness, provide Medicaid for every single uninsured person in the United States, institute universal pre-K for 3 and 4-year-olds, send $600 checks to 235 million Americans. That's the number who got the $600 checks in January 2021. And then the last one, so at this point, we're only halfway there. We're
Right,
less
and
than halfway there.
I think it's worth noting because it took me a minute to just wrap my brain around it. This is not one of these. These are all of these can be
Yes,
accomplished.
they're
with the
stacked on top
1.5.
of each other, dude.
Yeah,
I mean, it's
yeah.
so shocking. And then, I mean, I kind of had a moment of panic because at this point, like I did all this research and I'm, you know, I feel like a god, like solving extreme poverty and ending world hunger. And I'm like, oh, crap, I'm not even halfway there to using up all this money. So I did some research on what it would take to power half of U.S. households with solar. So I calculated the energy demand of U.S. households, and then the Department of Energy has this tool where it provides data on what it would take to build solar infrastructure, and then also all the stuff like not just building the panels itself, but building the energy storage capacity and delivering it so you could actually power U.S. households, the transmission lines, and that. So that would be a one-time payment of $596 billion. So I've done all this stuff, and I still have $77 billion left over.
Goodness.
And it's shocking because the Washington Post reported, and others have reported as well, that the 1.5 trillion request was actually delayed a bit because the Trump officials, like I did, struggled to figure out ways to spend it all. So Trump wants to provide the Pentagon with an amount of money they don't even know what to do with. I mean, it was always, you know, how quickly we went from $1 trillion budget from kind of a reference point like hyperbole to reality to, you know, 60% of what Trump wants to spend next year. We went like that.
Right.
And
right. No, I remember the rhetoric that, we're heading towards $1 trillion military budget. Well, that we got there awful fast.
Yeah. And depending on how you count it, like if you want to count like post-war costs, like veterans care and that sort of thing, we've been at 1 trillion for a while now, but now it's gradually taken less and less math to get there. And now it's just, yeah, that's the Pentagon budget itself. So here we are.
Yeah. And you also, just to let listeners know, that I wanted to say is a couple of months ago that you dug further as to just further back in the timeline. Why does this happen? And the enormous amount of campaign bribes, campaign contributions made by military contractors, and how that's influenced folks in Congress and obviously the presidential administrations as well. I think that was, you could probably remember, I think it was in December, you talked about how, the public doesn't want this. The public, to the extent that we understand this very broadly and across all kinds of ideologies, does not want this, but it happens. And the reason it happens is money, right?
Right. So in the intro, you said I worked in federal government relations. So that I'm a former arms industry lobbyist. I started my career out that way and kind of ended up there several times. I started as an intern in college, couldn't find a job after college, was hired as a legislative fellow at the same lobbying group. And then after grad school, couldn't find a job there either. And then ended up as director of defense legislation, which didn't last long because morally I had figured out who I was at that point. But the good news is I was trained by the best as far as government relations go. And now I'm carrying that work into advocacy. I will say, though, relevant to your question, it's a hell of a lot easier getting meetings with congressional offices when your office and the companies you represented donate millions of dollars each year. So on campaign cash, does it matter? I would say absolutely it matters. So for every military budget vote since 2018, I've compared the amount of money that members of Congress have taken from military contractors before they voted on the military spending legislation. In every single year, the results show what you'd expect them to show. The more money the members who vote yes on approving military spending increases take several times more on average than those who vote against such increases. I'm not talking about 1 or 2 years out of the 2018 to 2025 range. I'm talking every single year. There's a military spending increase. There's that ratio observed in both the House and Senate. And that's with, if you control for election cycle, or if you look at lifetime lifetime, I guess, acceptance of military contractor cash, you observe the same thing. And so the donations from military contractors is one thing that unites, I guess, my world to people who are, doing antitrust stuff or focused on any large company that donates a ton of money to members of Congress. I'm not saying that the focus on military contractors is special in any way, but it is unique in the sense that they're so dependent on government contracts that the cycle from public funds to private capital spent to manipulate the flow of public funds is very tight knit. So, for example, Lockheed Martin, over 70% of its annual revenue comes from U.S. government contracts.
Wow.
And then another 20 or 25% comes from government approved or government brokered foreign military sales, which are contracted through the same contracting mechanism as regular Pentagon contracts are. So at the end of the day, you have a company who's 95 to 97% dependent on Pentagon contracts, recycling a lot of that revenue from these contracts back into the political system to drive up the overall pot of resources that are available to them every year.
Well, we dig up the old Dr. King quote that the United States has socialism for the rich and rugged individualism for the poor. I think maybe we should be more specific about it. Socialism for military contractors, right? And I did not know you were a traitor to your class, right? You got schooled on how to do it from your work doing that lobbying early in your career. But for what it's worth, there's a real analogy in our law world. A lot of people get trained in big law and represent some horrible interests, but gain some skills and insights, and then go turn to public interest. And so you have some sisters and brothers in the law who've done the same thing. So glad you're doing that now. Yeah, I just did that list. Again, it's worth folks going through: end world hunger, end global extreme poverty, end U.S. homelessness, Medicaid for the uninsured, universal U.S. pre-K, $600 checks to 235 million Americans, which I do want to circle back to, because you wrote about how the Biden administration and Congress went back on that. And we saw that, you see that every day when you're working with poor people in the United States in eviction court, with that. In 2021, people were not getting evicted. People had options. People had tax credits. They had stimulus checks. They had, full food stamps, etc. Power half of the United States households with solar, with money left over, right? The money could be like a little bit of a weaning off maybe for Lockheed Martin, etc., and some reemployment for those folks in that industry, right?
Oh, yeah. The just transition thing is like, a common justification for all this quote unquote national security spending is jobs. And that's sort of the argument they resort to, because they realize the actual national security justification is non-existent or incredibly weak. So they default to, a bread and butter issue like jobs. But even if you accept the terms of that debate and you look at, okay, so how many jobs does this actually produce? Like, yes, military spending, on an econometric level does produce a certain amount of jobs per $1 million invested. I think it's like 6 per $1 million. But if you look at literally any other way to invest those funds and get jobs back, investing in literally any other sector is a more efficient producer of jobs. I mean, For education, it's something crazy. It's like two or 2.5 or 3 times more per dollar invested. But for, climate programs, infrastructure, construction,
Sure.
stuff like that, it's like 50% more, or in some cases 100% more per dollars invested. I forget what the question was. Sorry.
No, that kind of leads to, well, the question was just that idea of just transition and the fact
Oh,
that
yeah.
they'll lean back on jobs, like you say, which is a fraction compared to what green energy and infrastructure improvement and a return to something like the New Deal, right? Works Progress Administration, or it's so much. I live in a red state in Indiana. The infrastructure needs are enormous because we've underfunded the public sector so much. There's so many things that we could do with that money. And which I think kind of leads to what I wanted to ask about. You wrote, again, I think it was in December, that 1 in 10 voters want a bigger military budget. Literally 90% do not, but 8 in 10 senators voted for it. And that circles back to the campaign money. I once heard an advocate for campaign finance reform saying that doesn't necessarily need to be your most important issue. No, doesn't need to be campaign finance reform doesn't need to be your top issue, but it needs to be your first issue, because anything else we want to accomplish is going to be blocked by the money that's in politics now. But the public doesn't like that, to the point that the administration has lied in huge numbers, and you wrote about this, and that got a lot of play. I saw it a lot of different places where you crunched the numbers and found that the real cost of their Iran war was many times more than what the Trump administration was claiming. Like, how did you how did you uncover that? What do you see the number that they give, and obviously I think probably most of us distrust that number, but you're the one who could figure out why that's wrong. How did
Yeah,
you do that?
I've crunched war costs before, and I've tracked military and that sort of thing. I've written a couple papers for Brown University's Cost of War project, and Linda Bilmes, who wrote with Joe Stiglitz a best-selling book in the early 2000s, The $3 Trillion War, which is on the costs of the Iraq War. I've read that several times. It's somewhere behind me. But, you kind of just learn from people who are extraordinarily good at that sort of thing, and there's very few of them. Linda Bilmes is a professor at Harvard and best-selling author at this point for that book, and just an extremely cool person.
And Stiglitz says it's a Nobel Prize in economics, right? That little thing, right?
Yeah, but Linda's cooler, just because I know, just because I know her, not I really like Linda. But
yeah, that's good.
You learn from people who are extremely good at this stuff, and then you read research papers in other sectors, and you kind of combine methodologies, and you just figure out what's basically what's going on. And I wouldn't have done the analysis had the figure that Pentagon Chief Pete Hegseth and Acting Comptroller Jules Hurst gave Congress was so ridiculously low. And they said it was $25 billion to start, and then a couple weeks later it was $29 billion. Either way, it's impossibly low. Through 60 days, I counted $72 billion. I think it was $71.8 billion. And that's for operations, that's for expended munitions, that's for military aid to other countries relevant to the conflict, namely Israel, and also damaged and destroyed military assets, infrastructure, equipment, that sort of thing. You run all this cost together, and conservatively, I estimated $72 billion. And, to a certain extent, you can maybe really go into Pentagon math and figure out a way to say it's lower, but I don't see even being fully invested in the internal logics of Pentagon bookkeeping, can you produce a figure that's 25 or 29 billion? You're still looking at over 60 billion. So they're lying to Congress about the cost of the war, is what I'm trying to say, and doing it very, very patently. And one piece I have working out is supposed to be out yesterday, but I'm just writing incredibly slowly as of late. But I looked at all the public opinion data for every U.S. war where there's public opinion data for. So every war since World War II. And over time, just as a sneak preview, over time, wars get more unpopular. Even the popular ones like World War II that started with like 95% net approval and ended around 60 net approval, which is support minus opposition. So that's still wildly popular. Every war starts with positive public opinion, meaning there's more people who support it than oppose. And then some wars, recent ones typically, and Vietnam start with public net support and then end with negative. They end up underwater. The Iran war is the only one that has never had public support. It's been underwater the whole time. It started out at negative 13 net support, and now it's at negative 30. And this is really the only amusing part, is that you have an administration who are bona fide fascists. Like Pete Hegseth is fascism to, like, he's almost a caricature in that respect. Every media question or thing of accountability, it's, oh, that wasn't a very patriotic question. I think he's literally said that. So he just doesn't believe in accountability at all. And they're trying to create, they are a serious threat. I don't want to downplay it, but these are incompetent fascists. These are bumbling idiots. So they're trying to cultivate this image of a winning war, a productive war, a good war, and the public just isn't buying it. It just isn't buying it. And I think that feeds into why they lied about the cost of war, because it's a performative war. The peace through strength thing, which is the justification, it's based on performance, really, not necessarily theatrical, but it demands just a violent expression of force, because without it, it's meaningless. Because it's peace through strength, but strength being projection of military force in war. But without that projection of military strength in war, there's peace. So they're just trying to cultivate this image, and they're just radically overestimating their ability to manipulate public opinion. But again, they're really, when they lie about these costs, they're really lying to Congress and then us by proxy. They're just I think in part, they're lying just to provide Congress an out, basically, an excuse to provide funds. And from what I'm hearing on the Hill, Republicans are on board with the $1.5 trillion budget. Most of that's come through the regular budget, and then Trump wants another $350 billion through reconciliation, reconciliation is the process. His big, beautiful bill was passed last year. And then there's the Iran war supplemental, which, if you think my estimate is a little high, the latest reports is that the Pentagon is going to ask for 80 to 100 billion. So maybe my estimate is a bit low.
Wow. And you mentioned, Congress will almost certainly go along, and Democrats certainly aren't in control of Congress, but have an important role, have staff. Is it fair for me to be concerned that I am seeing these real costs coming from you and not seeing a lot of pushback from the loyal opposition saying that these are crazy? There's, all this lost opportunity, the numbers are lies, et cetera. I just don't see it as clearly and vociferously coming from most or many Democrats in Congress, or am I just missing it and they're doing this work too?
You'll see it from Democratic voters. You'll see it on Twitter or social media or whatever. And from Republican voters as well. You'll see it from damn near everybody except for Congress. Democratic politicians will, here's the state of play, and I'll generalize here in understanding there's exceptions. The establishment Democrats at this point in Congress realize that there is a benefit politically to being anti-war. And they will go as so far as introducing legal authorizations like war powers resolutions and stuff like that. They will bring up how Trump is prioritizing war over everyday needs, over affordability, which is true. But I'm trained in military spending legislation, and that's how I interpret the world in some ways, is that I follow the money, and I don't, I think those legal authorizations are important, and those legal constraints to limit Trump's destruction with the military those are really important. But when we're talking about actually enabling what Trump is doing, and you're talking about the most exalted purpose of Congress, you're talking about money. Congress has the power of the purse. But when it comes to military spending, Democrats just aren't willing to use it. The closest they got recently was after which ICE murder it was. Democrats introduced Democratic leadership, I should say, Schumer and Jeffries, introduced what I can only describe as a milquetoast set of reforms that ICE could have just rejected out of hand in exchange for ICE's regular budget. So Democrats wouldn't agree to pass ICE funding or broader Department of Homeland Security funding without accepting those reforms. And for whatever reason, Republicans just didn't accept those reforms, which I don't think Democratic leadership was expecting them to, which resulted in that huge drawn out shutdown that only ended recently. So what I'm saying is that Democrats, regardless of whether you're talking about the military or internal policing repression, are willing to fund it just as long as it looks okay on the surface. But as an example, the big beautiful bill last year, which they now call something else because it's polling so poorly. Now it's called like the Working Families Tax Cut Act.
I didn't know
or
that.
something.
Yeah, I hate that name.
Which is funny because people always people were complaining about the title "Big Beautiful Bill," but the public is, I think, smarter than people think. And they really, it's almost more insulting to call it that to them.
Especially when their Medicaid's getting cut off or their food stamps getting cut off.
So that bill liquefied social programs in order to pay for tax cuts and also in order to pay for increase in ICE spending, increase in military spending as well. And from what I hear from my sources on the Hill, which is a phrase I don't get to say much, so I'm going to revel in it. My sources on the Hill,
there you go,
say that Democratic leadership in the House, i.e. Hakeem Jeffries, word from that office was to the rank and file Democrats in Congress was to not protest the military spending in the bill. They said you could, complain about, it, in speech or introduce amendments that would maybe cut surface level or make conditional cuts to the $150 billion in extra military spending that bill had, but don't try to cut the whole thing. Don't make a scene about it. You can complain about anything else, but don't complain about the military spending. And that's the word is now that Democrats are just, leadership-wise, are just going to go along with the $1.5 trillion budget. They aren't going to try to cut it in any serious way. They might vote against the bill, whatever, they might vote against the standard military budget. They might vote against the they'll definitely vote against the reconciliation bill, most likely. And they might vote against the Iran supplemental bill. But I expect a few detractors, and I expect them not to do everything that they can to prevent that funding from being enacted. It's just not a priority for them, even though they realize being anti-war on the surface but they're just not willing to actually make the substantive changes necessary that reflect the public's will.
Right. And I will say again, your research shows why, that we don't have to wonder. This is not a philosophical choice. This is not a pro support our troops or job creation or any of that bullshit. It is about how these lawmakers have been funded, and your research. And I think I'm gonna point back again. I think it was December 2025. Your post about showing exactly what you said earlier is that senators and Congress people are voting with the side that's funding their campaigns, that's providing them the job security that they want, and way in contradiction to what their voters want. So
right, and that money it's about creating an ecosystem. The campaign contributions, the hiring of lobbyists, the funding of think tanks. That's an underrated one. Mm-hmm. If you look at the think tanks who provide experts to testify in front of Congress on military spending and foreign affairs matters, the experts overwhelmingly, and in some years entirely, come from think tanks funded by military contractors. So it's really about the money. Sometimes it functions in a quid pro quo, like backroom corruption sort of way, but it's really about keeping a certain attitude in Congress and building walls between Congress and the people it represents.
Well, and speaking of those walls, I want to also make sure we spend a little bit of time. You, again, your background is on this military spending and the military industrial complex, to what that's citing Eisenhower, right? We go back to that. But you've also, and again, they're not unrelated, but you've spent a fair amount of time and analysis on just how people are struggling economically here in the United States. And so you have a recent article about U.S. credit card debt, that we are and again, folks can probably either they know themselves or they know a loved one who is seriously underwater with credit card debt. But you showed exactly what we're talking about at a national level. So do you want to talk a little bit about that, and again how that is obviously tied to the now gas prices going up, food prices going up, et cetera. And we do know people who are using credit cards to buy groceries, to pay for healthcare, et cetera. So I think this was a May 16th article by you that I want folks to go back. I think the title is U.S. credit card debt is historically high. So what did you find when you researched this?
The U.S. credit card debt is historically high.
Okay.
In fact,
Good headline.
I just wrote, I got an editor from MarketWatch, which is I guess like affiliated with like Wall Street Journal.
Okay.
I just wrote an opinion piece that's based on that analysis, and MarketWatch is not a website I would normally read, or I don't think I've ever read it. In fact, because it's very like investor based.
Yeah.
But it said something that the editor reached out and wanted me to write something about it. So it's kind of good news that this is gaining currency.
Mm-hmm.
I did use, the word consumer will probably be like used in the op-ed, and I'd never use like the word consumer, but that sort of thing. But it's cool. It's cool that the thing about, the thing that worries me about the credit card debt thing is just how prolific it is, and just more people have it. The total is higher, and the debt is more expensive to carry. So APRs went from 15 or 16%, around 2015 to 2019, to now it's at 22 or 23%. I think most recently it's at 21.5%.
Yeah.
Which is insane.
Yeah.
So, and I think like all those market research firms, like I studied like a Bain & Company study for it, and they're like, oh yeah, this is really bad. This is a very, very strong indicator that consumer health, is a term they use, is very poor. And I would agree in my own terms. So I guess I'm concerned, not I guess, I mean, I'm concerned with matters of security, and I'm trained, in school of matters of national security. But the perspective of how I interpret the world is through a lens of a concept I'm developing, or has been developed in the past, and I'm trying to refine, is working class security. So instead of evaluating security conditions in the United States through the lens of the state, what's good for the nation, what's bad for the nation, you look at how is the working class doing, which is good because those are the people mostly who are living in the country. So you're not asking about how the country's doing, you're asking about how the people are doing who are living in it. And another good thing about that, lens is that it immediately binds you to the working class abroad too. So you're able to see past states, and you're able to interpret, the conditions that tie you, yourself, guy in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I am, or Bloomington, Indiana, abroad. So I interpret the world in that respect. So that ties in the military spending portion and wars and that sort of thing, but also it ties me into your world as well, because you're talking about the everyday conditions that people live in. What are the most urgent threats that are facing them? And public health research over the last 200 years have shown, if housing isn't in order, everything else falls apart, really.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's really the most important part. And as it's amusing in some respects that if you look at a chart on credit card debt, or if you look at a chart on poverty, or any chart really on economic insecurity, which is the ability to reliably make one's ends meet, they all show the same thing, which is, if you're starting in 2019, it shows a dip in 2020, or a decrease in insecurity. So an improvement in 2020, then a major improvement in 2021, a worsening in 2022, worsening in 2023, and a continued worsening after that. And that aligns perfectly with the creation and dissolution of the pandemic welfare state. The eviction moratorium you mentioned earlier, there was additional funding for housing security provided through, I think, the American Rescue Plan, and I think maybe even the CARES Act as well.
Right, both.
But basically, what I was talking about, that difference between national security and working class security, or human security, I guess would be the more popular term, is that in 2021, the US government changed its perspective from being just intensely focused in prioritizing national security to focusing on human security. And the results were obvious. I mean, historic reduction in poverty and child poverty. And then,
During a pandemic, for goodness sakes, right? When
which is
people were-
wild.
Yeah.
Imagine if we did that when macroeconomic conditions, I should say, were good. It would be sublime. But instead, what happened was a nightmare unfolded. We saw this historic reduction in poverty and child poverty. And again, every single chart looks the same way. So I made one that at the bottom, it shows the poverty rate, supplemental poverty rate. So it shows it from 2019, 11.8 to 12.9 for standard, and then 12.6 to 13.4. And compared to 2020 to 2024, it was 9.7 to 13.4, and then 9.2 to 12.9%. So you show this huge increase from 2019 to 2024, or 2020 to 24, and in between a huge reduction in 2021. And again, if you that same shape of graph follows from whatever level of economic insecurity you look at. So if you say poverty is like the baseline, most severe level of economic insecurity, and then above that you have the percentage of people who paid overdraft or NSF fees at their bank, and then above that you have the data on the people who said they have difficulty paying household bills at some point in the last week or month or year.
Mm-hmm.
Then above that you say the broader measure of that the Federal Reserve does of living comfortably, the percentage of people who are living comfortably or not. At every level, it just makes the same exact shape. So whichever level of economic security you care about, you're indirectly caring about the other ones as well, or you should at least, because I don't know whether you call poverty a leading indicator at that point, but what I'm saying is that they all follow the same shape, and they all follow the creation and destruction of the pandemic welfare state. And that destruction of that pandemic welfare state happened at the exact worst time, which was during a historic bout of inflation.
Right. And again, anyone doing frontline work with poor folks was seeing it. We see folks who are sleeping in their cars as a result of that, right? People are literally sleeping on the street as a result of that, going without health care. And I want to point out that, we talk about Biden in 2021 and American Rescue Plan, but I said it's the CARES Act. This was 2020. This was Trump administration. So there was enough political momentum that we really made this huge change. And I want to make sure that listeners know that when we're talking numbers, mostly Stephen's talking numbers because he's much better at that time, but his charts are amazing, and the charts are incredibly understandable for a non-data person like me and for others as well. So that's, again, StephenStemler.com, where I am happy to be a paid subscriber, and you should be too. Can't remember what it costs. It doesn't cost much. It was a bargain. And I do want to just affirm to folks that you are connecting, if we're concerned, and probably a lot of these listeners are concerned with the U.S. poverty that we're seeing in our communities, maybe in our work, on our streets, in our neighborhoods. It's very, very much tied to the spending and the crazy militarism that we are focused on at the national level. And Stephen always makes that point and connects it to it. So before we sign off, I want to be respectful of your time here, but I want to talk a little bit about your path. You've mentioned a little about that you had a period of time where you were working on what did you say? You didn't say defense contractor. What did you say? War spending? I think you were.
I said, I worked in government relations as a lobbyist for military contractors.
Military contractors, okay.
Yeah.
But you said national security in quotes. I like your rephrasing a few times of that. This is not about national security. It's about financial security for billionaires.
Yeah.
And their contractors. So can you talk a little bit about your path to? In fact, you did do humanitarian work. How did you get to doing data journalism?
Yeah, in between my career as an arms industry lobbyist, I was able to do a little bit of soul searching, ended up in the humanitarian sector working for this giant NGO. It was based in Beirut. I think it was called the Syria Humanitarian Access Team. This is about providing intelligence and logistics and just providing, on the ground research about needs, barriers to entry to people actually delivering the humanitarian assistance on the ground. The office was called the Syria Humanitarian Access Team, but I think they changed the name after I pointed out that the acronym spelled out SHAT. So I think it's called something else now. Like, I think it's like,
Oh, you earned your salary just doing that.
yeah. I thought it was funny. I think they were horrified, but I think that is when I really started to pay attention to those on the ground indicators, because in the humanitarian sector, you look at, human security indicators all the time. But when it comes to the US, like, the data is available, but people don't pay attention to it. And then other times the data is just not available. There's the Census Bureau had this thing called the Household Pulse Survey during the pandemic, which rocked. It asked about housing, how they, not just current conditions, but past conditions and their expectations for the future. So in your world, which is so cool, by the way. I didn't know you took your students to eviction court. That rocks, dude.
Yeah, and we referenced the Household Pulse Survey about the number of people behind on rent and behind on their mortgage that are just on the verge, right? And you can imagine the stress. And of course, many times people get pushed off that edge.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. They don't do, is that not, was that just a pandemic level of detail, or they still do that?
So they resurrected it, but it's much slower now. And there actually is, I'll send it to you. I looked at the data. I think they still have housing data. I'll send you the numbers. I haven't published it anywhere. I'll just send you the spreadsheet I was able to crunch. But it comes as like a public use file, which I had to like figure out how to decode by myself instead of like the one reason the Household Pulse Survey was great is because it was like this interactive dashboard you could track in real time. And if you look at any one of those indicators on housing security, economic insecurity, food insecurity, they all follow. And you plot it out by year, they all improve radically in 2021. It's actually kind of nice to look at as someone who has a bit of an obsessive thing going on. It's just like they all follow the same shape.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. So that's where my interest started, was in the humanitarian sector, focusing on those everyday lived conditions. Because I studied foreign affairs and political science in undergrad and grad school, and I remain deeply interested in that sort of thing. But at the same time, I realized there's a connection there between, international security and human security. And I thought the latter was wildly underrated, because you look at national security, that what is national security? The national interest is determined by the people in charge, and the people in charge are routinely and structurally put private interests over the public interest. So I wanted to, kind of balance those worlds. As far as the graph thing and the data journalism part, like, initially my newsletter started as an advisory service to candidates challenging incumbents on the congressional level. So I was advising congressional candidates informally and sometimes formally through that channel. And then I didn't bother putting any like paywall or anything up. So kind of word got out and other people started paying attention to it. So it kind of spiraled from there. The chart thing, I honestly can't remember. I think I had a post that did really well. And I realized that I was a good writer, maybe even very good, but not brilliant. And I was also getting annoyed by people who I think use bad word efficiency and really made readers work to find the point of the article.
Yeah.
So I kind of overreacted in a way and said, okay, so how can I channel those complaints and that feedback into a source where people can read the text of the email they want, or read the newsletter if they want, but they can quickly scroll and see the main takeaway right away. And at least, like, if they disagree with my perspective, they at least have some concrete data that they can interpret however they like. So now I've chosen that theme, and now it's about every newsletter has a chart, and I force it to be that way, even if it's not conducive. So, which is good, because that constraint breeds creativity. So, and it forces me to actually do a lot of empirical research that I wouldn't have done otherwise.
Right. You can't, a chart can't lie, right? It's not a subjective piece of information. I got to say, as somebody who is a big fan of your stuff, that's the first thing I look at. Before every, I'm a text person, I'm a words person, but I will look at the chart, the visual, the power of that is worth your effort. So thank you for making the effort. And like you say, even
Well,
if
that means
it's
so much to me,
hard
Fran.
to shoot.
Coming from you, dude. I mean,
Yeah.
that really means a lot.
No, it's,
So
and
I'm
I've
happy you
got to say,
appreciate it.
I'm trying to think if I haven't, I will. As a teacher, you're, putting things up on a screen a lot, and no, and again, we'd like to think the students are reading everything you assign, but a chart is something everybody's going to understand, and you can talk about it in the class. It's like, oh my God, what about this? And yeah, it's worth the. I don't know how much time you put into it, but it's the end
Well,
result is definitely worth it.
they take forever. They come out, and I think people just assume that it's kind of an automated process. No. If there's an automated process, like I don't think I've ever used one, and a
Mm,
lot of times it doesn't exist or would provide accurate data, even if there was.
right.
But no, I very much collect the data by hand. It's a artisanal data collection, if you will.
There you go. That's right.
And one thing I've heard that my charts get shown in high school social studies classes and other classes in high school level, which was super flattering.
Absolutely.
That and them
Yeah.
being shown and referenced on podcasts are like two of the, and then also being used to call people idiots indirectly on social media is another method, another use that I find very amusing. But yeah, that's one reason I try to keep the language PG, because that's shown in high school classrooms, though sometimes when you talk about this stuff, it's hard.
Right. No, the ripple effects of that, right? That a 15-year-old that's coming into political consciousness is seeing that and talking about it with their peers or online or showing their parents the error of their ways. Oh, that's great. That's great. You don't even know what impact that's having.
Yeah. In the footnotes, I let myself become unglued a little bit, and I make a lot of sarcastic remarks, along with rigorous citations and off-cue remarks you'll find in the footnotes. But otherwise, Fran, I mean, I'm so flattered that you support my work and read my newsletter, and I follow your newsletter as well. I'm going to follow your podcast, so it's great to finally talk to you in person, dude.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it, Stephen. And again, I just want to reference StephenSemler.com. That's where you can find the not just the newsletter, but also, and then I'll put the links in the show notes of how to follow you on social. And because this is important stuff, it's going to continue to be important stuff. And again, a lot of Stephen's stuff is that we're living in a hellscape of a Trump administration and a Republican-controlled Congress, but Democrats haven't taken the opportunities that they have had in the past. They need to do that if they get the opportunities in the future, and it's going to take this kind of information from us who are going to advocate for that. So, Stephen, thank you for being on the show. Really appreciate it, and thanks for your continued work. And if you don't mind, I'm certainly going to circle back on, who knows what the next developments are going to be that you're going to be writing about. So we'd love to have you on the show again sometime.
That sounds great to me, man. Reach out anytime.
Okay, thanks. And thanks everyone for listening. And remember, until we meet again next week, we can do better. And we've just heard a lot about how we can find the money to do better. So thanks to Stephen Semler. Thanks you all for listening, and we will see you next time.